Started to record. All right, everyone. Well, good luck. I'm excited to hear what you all say. And like I said, if there are any other issues, feel free to text and we can get that all taken care of. All righty, I'm gonna start broadcasting. Okay, alrighty, welcome everyone to the webinar. It will begin right at the top of the hour in just a few seconds. And it will be recorded and it is broadcasting to Facebook as well. So let me pull this up. Okay, and also, remember to follow the campaign for grade level reading on both Twitter and Facebook. Feel free to use the hashtags GLR reading and hashtag Learning Tuesdays to share, any thoughts or information that may come up during this webinar. We're excited to have you all joining us. Okay, and these are just a few housekeeping webinar tips. If everyone could just go ahead and introduce themselves into the chat box, that would be perfect. You can go ahead, share your name, your organization, where you're from. And also all attendees are currently participating in listen-only mode. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and post in the Q&A box. We will go ahead and get to those at the end of the webinar. Like I said, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available. And once again, there will be a brief evaluation survey posted during the Q&A as well. Okay, and then lastly, some upcoming webinars. We will have a webinar on Tuesday, August 11th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We invite all of you to join that as well, and we will also have one on Tuesday, August 18th, both talking about some after-school opportunities and leveraging the power of data and relationships. Now, once again, I will be passing it off to Sarah, who will be introducing Lisa and our lovely panelists.
Thank you for that intro and overview, Sierra. And to everyone else, welcome. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Connecting the Digital Deserts, Some Promising Early Solutions. This is a conversation that builds on our May 26th GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, which examined the scope, extent, and dimensions of digital inequity in the United States. And so in that session, we began to unpack what this crisis means for millions of students and their families who've been effectively shut out of digital learning during this pandemic because of a lack of devices, connectivity, and online support. So that first conversation really focused on the problem we're facing. Today's webinar is going to focus on solutions and ways that we can begin to address the digital equity gap at the local level. Our speakers will be sharing, excuse me, insights and examples of community-driven solutions and exemplary municipal networks. So with that background, let's go ahead and get started. And to do that, I'm incredibly honored and excited to introduce and welcome our moderator for today. That's Lisa Guernsey of New America. Lisa Guernsey is the Director of Teaching, Learning, and Tech Program and Senior Advisor to the Early and Elementary Education Policy Program at New America. Guernsey focuses on new approaches to help students and families succeed in the digital age. And her work involves leading teams of analysts and writers to translate research, examine policies, and generate new ideas for developing high-quality learning opportunities for underserved and historically disadvantaged populations. Prior to her work at New America, Guernsey was a staff writer at the New York Times and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and she's contributed to various national publications and is also co-author with Michael H. Levine of Tap, Click, Read, Growing Readers in a World of Screens. So welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us again to explore the challenge and now solutions to the digital equity gap in the United States.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome to everybody. It's really fun to see all of the attendees and so many amazing places that you're all from. So thank you for putting that into the chat so we can get a sense of the energy in the room, so to speak. This is my second time this summer moderating a grade level reading Learning Tuesdays webinar. I'm really thrilled to be part of this. The GLR team is fantastic. As many of you know, there have been so many really important webinars that they've produced that are really timely and helpful. And this is one that could not be more timely right now as we're dealing with what it really means for our kids and our families across the country as schools are still shuttered, and we've got to find a way to support their learning virtually and in so many places. So we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But first, I just want to introduce to you who will be with us for this conversation. We're very lucky to have two amazing presenters who are really going to help us see some promising solutions, some ways to truly help and support families. Claire Park, who is one of my colleagues at New America. She's in the Open Technology Institute. She's a program associate there and has been doing a lot of writing on these issues over the past year. She researches and writes on a number of tech policy issues, including broadband access and competition, but also privacy. And before supporting OTI's work, she was a fellow of the German Academic Exchange Service and has completed her master's in science and politics, economics, and philosophy at Universität Hamburg, and I'm probably not saying that with enough German accent, but really glad to have Claire with us, and you'll hear about her latest report. And then we'll also be joined by Hal Woods, and Hal will be speaking about the Chicago Connected project, which is just a fantastic initiative that I've heard about it through many channels over the past 30 days with people sending me emails about it or asking, wait, do you know about this? Or what can we learn from this? So Hal, thank you so much for being with us. Hal currently serves as Chief of Policy at Kids First Chicago, which is a nonprofit organization in Chicago that believes families, community members, and educators are best equipped to design the educational policies and systems that improve equity and lead to stronger outcomes for Chicago students and communities. And before joining Kids First, Hal was the Director of Strategy in the CEO's office, as well as Executive Director of the Office of Innovation and Incubation at Chicago Public Schools. And we'll hear about the Chicago Public School Connection very much so today. And prior to his time at CPS, Hal served as advisor to the president at the Chicago Transit Authority. So thank you so much, Hal, for being with us. And we'll also, after our two presenters, we'll be able to bring in some more dialogue and hear some perspectives from two other amazing kind of voices in this field. Matthew Henkes, who is the Vice President for Grants and Initiatives at Iowa West Foundation, will be providing some perspective and also will tell us a little bit about how things have been working in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and how some of the solutions there lend themselves to this moment as well. And then we're very lucky to have Amina Fazullah with us as well. Amina is the Equity Policy Council in Common Sense Media's DC office and has worked on a range of different tech policy issues, from privacy to expanding technology and digital well-being. So thank you so much to both of you for being with us. And we'll be moving kind of quickly through the next 30 minutes or so, and then getting a moment from both of those commentators to provide their perspective. I'll be asking some questions along the way to keep things going. And then just know that we're going to have a really robust time for Q&A from all of the attendees. So you'll be able to, as we go along, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, but then we'll also make sure we're reserving time at the end for that. And you can ask questions of any of us who are here, but particularly of our panelists who have so much to share. So to just get us started and kind of prime the pump, so to speak, I want to just take you through a couple of slides to explain, really why we're here today. The issues of learning loss are front and center in many of our minds, but also just what families are going through right now and what they're struggling with in terms of their own family supports and trying to kind of keep things together as well, certainly unemployment's a really big issue, but of course our public health crisis and how much stress we're facing today in terms of just being still very worried about getting sick and making sure our families are safe. So on top of that, to have problems of being able to connect to information and to be able to get good information and feel connected to community, that's just an incredible load to be put. It's incredibly unfair to today's families to have that stress of not being able to connect on top of everything else. So if you go to the next slide, I want to just kind of take you through some of the kind of key points of digital inequities that we're dealing with right now. As many as 12 million children in the United States don't have internet access at home. Claire will tell us a little bit more about some of those data points, but this is from the national perspective. And some of those numbers are actually depending on what study you're looking at, or even higher. 17% of students do not have broadband at home, and in your own communities, that number also may be quite different. And we also need to remember that not all teachers have high-speed internet access at home either, to be able to do these kinds of Zoom calls that we're on right now and to be able to do what they can for their students. We had an opportunity at New America to try to keep on top of this information, and we have a blog, edcentral.org, where we'll keep people posted on these issues. But this graphic that you're seeing right here in front of you right now is from one of my colleagues at New America who's been writing about these issues and some others, and you can find that. I think we'll put it in the chat as well, but you can find that blog and others about kind of what it means for teachers on our website. So we also need to recognize that in addition to these three just kind of general points, what this means for today's youngest learners. So I put up here just a screenshot of a Facebook Live story time from a public library in Virginia. I'm a Virginian, and always love to see what our public libraries are doing in my state. And like many public libraries right now, they too are trying to figure out how to best serve the families that are their constituents when they can't necessarily have families coming into the building. And so they're providing things like these amazing story times. We have teachers and librarians who are setting up their entire living rooms as puppet show theaters these days to be able to provide these things to families. And it's amazing what you can really engage young children with even at a distance. But these are only available to students and families and to our young children if they have enough, a strong enough internet access and robust enough connection to be able to see the Facebook Live story time, right? So just think about how unfair and inequitable this is for so many families when they don't have the chance to connect to something like this. So we have been pursuing this at New America through both the Ed Policy Group that I'm with, as well as the Open Technology Institute. And I just want to quickly call out to you that there was a webinar about a month ago, actually more than a month ago, on June 25th, that some of you may also want to tap into, called Closing the Home Learning and Homework Gap. And in that webinar, we also heard from FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, who's long been an advocate for federal broadband programs such as E-rate, and we may talk about that a bit today. But we also heard from leaders at the local level, including the Chief Technology Officer for Council Bluffs Community School District in Iowa, David Fringer, and we'll be talking a little bit more about Iowa later today, as well as Tina Hike-Hubbard, Chief Communications and Community Engagement Officer for Baltimore City. And she also has some really good ideas about kind of some promising solutions. So I just wanted to call those out. So with that kind of set up, I'm going to now lead us into a conversation with Claire. Again, Claire, thank you for joining us here. And if you don't mind, Claire, just to kind of get us set up, tell us about kind of the lay of the land and what you're seeing on the ground in communities that might tell you that we may have some solutions at hand. We just need to figure out how to harness them. So take it away, Claire.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. If we can go to the next slide, and maybe just the next slide. Yeah, so one approach that is, I think, underrated to getting people connected is community-initiated broadband networks. So more than 900 communities across the US are actually connected by a community broadband network, and 560 are served by some form of a municipal network. So a community broadband network, what we mean by that is basically it's an umbrella term for any network that's not run by a private internet service provider, but rather community initiated and operated. So municipal networks are run by municipalities. You also have networks run by rural electric cooperatives and telephone cooperatives. And these networks can really, well, one thing that they can do is pressure providers in the area already to improve quality of service and lower costs. But anywhere where communities are underserved, where residents feel like they need to have better service, one way they can do that is just by building their own networks. So yeah, in terms of, we published a report earlier this year in May about community broadband networks and offered some examples of different networks and also tribal networks. But for the sake of this, I'll just keep it short. So one of the networks that we looked at, for instance, was in Longmont, Colorado, called Nextlight. And the town actually experienced particular difficulties in getting their network up and running because of state legislative barriers that exist to prevent municipalities from forming their own networks. So Longmont is a town of about 97,000 people, and they actually already had existing infrastructure to build out a network, but couldn't because of the law. And then the residents rallied and had a referendum to exempt the city from the law, and they won. And so they ended up building Nextlight, and the service is great. It's much better and cheaper than mine, actually. Yeah, so that's one example.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claire. And I didn't want to cut you off there too much, because I know there are a couple of other examples in your report of other localities that are doing this. If you guys don't mind, let's move back to that slide one more time, and then we'll get into, I'm curious about these cost questions. I want to get to those for sure. But are there other local areas, Claire, that you want to highlight in addition to the Longmont, Colorado?
Yeah, so besides,
I think so.
Besides Nextlight, one of the ones that we also discuss in our report is Fairlawn Gig. It's in a small town in Fairlawn, Ohio, about 7,500 people, and they actually got their network up and running in the span of 5 years. And 1 year after, so they started in 2015, and by 2017, they already had 45% of the market share for both business and residential customers. So that's a resounding success there. I also briefly wanted to mention, I definitely want to mention EPB. So EPB is one of the better known examples of a municipal network, but they actually this week announced that, EPB is a municipal broadband network in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they announced this week that in partnership with their county schools, they would be offering free service and a router to 28,500 students in the Hamilton County School District to ensure that the students would have access to internet with the school year coming up this fall. So I thought that was a really great example of how a community network prioritizes getting people in their community connected, including their students. And then Islesboro, Maine is just a really great example as well, because over 72% of residents had, dial-up internet, that really slow, by telephone internet that we used to have. And then they made their own community network, and now they pay $30 a month for gigabit speed internet, which is very fast. It's 10 times as fast as mine, and half as expensive as my own internet service. So those are some, great examples.
So Claire, before we go on to the question of cost, let me ask a basic question here. And these examples, are we talking about fiber line Ethernet connection, or are we talking about Wi-Fi only or some combination?
Yeah, so all of these examples that I've given here actually are all fiber broadband networks. So fiber is kind of currently the gold standard. And obviously you can have Wi-Fi coming off of your fiber infrastructure, but you can't have Wi-Fi without the existing, like a broadband network infrastructure. And so, I mean, all of these places can have Wi-Fi now that at least people who subscribe to these services can have Wi-Fi now as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to touch on that. So, so I know that one of your latest reports is looking at the affordability question, because when we talk about equity and the kind of inability for some families to be able to log in and get the kind of robust internet access we need, it's partly because of how expensive it may be for them, or the, you know, the cost of those monthly bills. So tell us a little bit about what you're learning on the affordability and the cost of connectivity side of things.
Yeah, sure. So if we go to the next slide, we can actually see, so for reference, OTI has published since 2012 a report that looks at basically the price and speed of internet service plans across the US and also in cities elsewhere in the world. And this year, there were 5 within our US data set that, 5 cities within our data set that included municipal networks. And so we did a small analysis to see, you know, things that we might notice about price and quality of service in those cities. And this graph shows how one thing that we found was that, at least within the data set that we had, the average price per megabit per second, so just looking at like basically how many, you know, what speed do you get for a dollar, that average cost was brought down by the presence of a municipal network in all of these cities that had municipal networks. So in Amman, that we see the biggest difference there. You know, the average price per megabit per second is brought down by like 46%, which is pretty nuts. And they have one of the most affordable service plans that we found across our entire data set. And we also see a similar effect in Lafayette and Chattanooga, Wilson, Fort Collins, other places as well. You know, there's a 10% decrease, which is, well, 8.4, 8.5 decrease, which is still a lot of money when you think about how much you're paying per month.
And where is Amman?
Amman is in Idaho. Yes.
Oh, okay. And Wilson?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So Amman's in Idaho, Lafayette in Louisiana, Chattanooga, Tennessee. That's where I mentioned EPB doing the program with the county schools. Wilson is in North Carolina, and Fort Collins is in Colorado. So Fort Collins is another one of those cities in Colorado that hosted a referendum to get past the state law against mutiny networks.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I guess if you go to the next slide too, just to make the point clear, it's not just about cost, but also there's a difference. Like we actually do see the impact of a community network coming in on quality too, in the form of speed. So you can also take a look at our report online too, but we just saw that you know, speeds were much higher with the presence of municipal networks than without. And as you can see in all these cities, the private networks actually offered substantially slower speeds than the municipal networks did. So.
And in terms of kind of, we'll move on to Hal in a moment here, but Claire, if there are some kind of key recommendations or policy kind of nudges that you might give related to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, part of my job. If you go to the next slide, I've listed kind of the 3 things that I see being the most important. So we definitely need to remove state legislative barriers to municipal broadband. As account from this year is that some 20 states still have legislative barriers, and actually a bill proposed by the House earlier in July, I guess that's last month already, actually would do this, would remove these barriers so that communities can determine for themselves whether they want to form their own network. I also think that requiring pricing transparency is really important. The federal government doesn't collect any data right now on internet service plans, which is part of the reason why OTI does its cost of connectivity report every year. But we see the impact of pricing transparency also in like the recent success of the E-rate program. having prices be clear makes sure that consumers know how much they're paying, and also makes it much more apparent how much ISPs are charging for their services. And at least for any communities who are thinking about like if a network might be useful, there are lots of requests, RFPs and budget proposals from other successful cities that you can look at, and you can look through our reports to find more about that too. But that's where I would start for sure.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claire. Food for thought there. And I think we'll get into some more questions about what at the city level one can do, and then where some state policies either are helpful or hurtful in this endeavor, as well as federal ones. So we'll make sure we're continuing that stream of conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Hal Woods from First Chicago to take us through the impressive work that's underway in that city to make sure more and more students and their families are connected. So Hal, can you just give us a sense of how Chicago Connected got started, and give us a scope of this project, right? And what you guys have been kind of handling over the past 30 days.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for having me here today. So Kids First Chicago is a nonprofit here in Chicago that believes that families are best equipped to design and not just be sort of thought partners, but actually help design some of the education policies and systems that'll improve equity and lead to better outcomes for Chicago students. So Kids First involvement with the digital divide issue here in Chicago really started in late March after the governor had closed schools until initially the end of April and eventually for the rest of the school year. Kids First reached out to over 200 families in our parent network and asked them what they and their communities needed most right now. So I think on the next slide, you can see some of the quotes that we have from some of our parents. And it really became apparent to us through those conversations that that internet access, while we had treated it as somewhat of a luxury before and kind of assumed that folks could go to the library, once those opportunities were taken away, we saw just how pronounced the challenge was going to be for students to be able to engage the school districts' remote learning content with that lack of connectivity. And so you can see some of the quotes here that just kind of talk about how pronounced the gap is, and also how this was going to adversely impact their students throughout the rest of the closure of in-person instruction. So if we go to the next slide, we knew that there was this inequity, but the problem was that there wasn't an accurate source as to how pronounced the internet connectivity gap was here in Chicago. So what we did was we looked at the American Community Survey data. And as you can see, here, we learned that 1 out of 5 children in the city of Chicago lack in-home broadband internet access. And in certain communities, that number was close to 1/3 or even 1/2. And if you go even deeper into certain census tracts, you'll see that upwards of almost 75% of certain census tracts in different communities in Chicago lack, with households with children, lack in-home broadband access. You can see on the next 2 slides, essentially some maps that sort of display how pronounced the connectivity gap is. So you can see that plot of downtown Chicago and kind of the surrounding areas on the south, on the west, and even parts of the north side as well, northwest side as well. That's the raw number of students. On the next slide, you can see the percentage number of households with children lacking internet access. So what we did at Kids First is we partnered with a local think tank to produce a report that combined both the voices of many of our city's parents about the challenges presented by the lack of access to internet, but then we also coupled that with the census data, which clearly outlined just how pronounced the divide was or is in our city. And as well as we put together some recommendations about leading or promising solutions to help address the connectivity gap here in Chicago. The report also served as a call to action for the city, Chicago Public Schools, which is the local school district, as well as the city's philanthropic community and our internet service providers to collectively come together to solve this challenge, both to help not only kids during the pandemic, but also to help create a foundation for sustainable digital inclusion solutions in the future as well. And not to fast forward too quickly, but after our report's release, we were asked to form a working committee with the mayor's office here in the city, as well as the school district, where we met multiple times a day over 6 weeks to help operationalize what this plan would look like. The effort attracted significant attention from our philanthropic community. I want to certainly say, tremendous gratitude to Ken Griffin, the Citadel CEO, who had a tremendous anchor contribution of $7.5 million, Crown Family Philanthropies, which gave over $5 million to the initiative as well. I think what attracted philanthropy the most was that it was a solution that was solvable. You know, in Chicago, we have the luxury of we have a pretty strong broadband infrastructure, so that we don't have an issue with there's a lot of connectivity gaps in terms of what the infrastructure existing. But we were also, I think we had the concrete data to kind of back up just what the divide was. So it was a solution that we were able to build a budget around and really kind of get help clarify any concerns that our philanthropic partners might have to actually how big the contribution needed to be to actually tackle this challenge. We also worked very close with our internet service providers that were very helpful partners to help meet the policy objectives of both the city and the CPS, so that we were able to eliminate any sort of common barriers that might prevent a household from signing up, even after you remove cost as a barrier, just to make sure that when it came to any hidden fees or any any like service call fees, background checks, credit checks, all those kind of barriers were eliminated. When you think about CPS serving a high percentage of undocumented students as well, it was critical that we had no barrier for folks being able to sign up as long as they can prove who they are and prove their address as well. So we can jump to the next slide, but where we ended is essentially is a 4-year, $50 million initiative that will serve roughly 60,000 households, which ultimately is about 100,000 students. Chicago Public Schools is using a variety of, and we can jump to the next slide. Thank you. A variety of equity-based indicators you can see at the bottom where to determine student eligibility. So these are both based on factors of where the household is and sort of the free reduced lunch status of the household itself, but also student level indicators such as diverse learners, English language learners, obviously students in temporary living situations as well. The United Way of Metro Chicago will actually serve as the fiscal agent. So essentially after a family does get signed up, they never see a bill from any of their internet service providers, as United Way of Metro Chicago actually pays those bills directly on behalf of eligible families. I will say that the program does include a hotspot component as well. We are prioritizing broadband, high-speed, fixed-line, in-home access, but we know that for our students' temporary living situations or even housing insecure families or more mobile families, that we felt it was critical to have a hotspot component as well. And so that there's a significant portion of our budget allocated to that as well. I think the final piece is our reliance on community-based organizations here in Chicago as well. When we first started having conversations about the need to have an initiative that was able to connect students that weren't able to learn through the district remote learning due to this connectivity gap challenge, a lot of our community-based organizations wanted to help out. And we know that, and what we've seen so much in terms of the sign-up data is that it's absolutely critical that the folks that are reaching out to eligible families are trusted partners. When people get a text message that says, congratulations, you're able to have free internet through Chicago Connected, they don't believe it. It sounds, in some cases, too good to be true. And so our community partners are going to be critical to help us with supplementing outreach. But we're also going to be relying on them, and we have a series of trainings with national organizations, but also with the Chicago Public Library here that I'll talk a little bit more about later, to have those community-based organizations actually deliver digital literacy training to all newly connected households as well, so that those households can actually use the internet more effectively once they do get connected.
Wow, thank you so much, Hal. So I know other probably have a lot of questions as well, but it is really, it's exciting to see what can be possible for students and families given what you're providing here. So before I get to a couple of the other questions, I just want to make sure I'm kind of visualizing too what this is going to mean. So that the households that they won't have a bill to pay, but they will get the connection to their apartment building or straight into their apartment. Does it also mean that they'll get a router where they could have, say, Wi-Fi, so multiple people in a household could be on a device at one time, or any of those other things that I know are kind of, there's always this, it's not even just last mile, it's like the last 3 feet of like making this happen for families? Sure.
Yes, so this is predicated pretty much exclusively, except for the hotspot component, on a fixed in-home router. And so with the capacity to have multiple members of the household, whether it be multiple students doing different things online, or even to have a parent researching telehealth resources at the same time while one of the students is engaging with, a Google Classroom conversation with a student, while maybe another student in the household is doing research using being able to access one of Chicago Public Library's research databases for free. And so that was very important to us. We know that hotspots can provide the same level of quality of service, the 25.3 megabytes per second download and upload speeds, but we also know that hotspots typically are more of like a one-to-one sort of device to the hotspot, as opposed to having multiple devices using a single hotspot. And so, we also, that's why we're relying more on the fixed line in-home broadband access. I think to your other question, which was about the connection, actually how families actually kind of install this. So we do have this really kind of an abundance of options. We can, the internet providers actually ship the router directly to the families, or there's a sort of a socially distant compliant way that technicians can actually come in and make an installation themselves if the family feels more comfortable doing that.
Thank you. Yeah, it feels like that even for, I'll just say, even our staff at New America, we have 125 analysts and staff members at New America now that are all spread all over the DC region and Chicago and California, and just making sure that they had what they needed at home was not that easy. Like we had to figure out how to, some of them hadn't set up that router yet. And it's, it's an extra piece of the puzzle to make sure that there's support so that people don't feel like they're just throwing up their hands like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this device now, or with this like box now. So tell us a little bit more as well, Hal, if you could, about some of the digital literacy efforts that you've talked about, and how to ensure that those who are getting connected kind of really feel like they've got the support to use that connection.
So I think what, as we think about what the pandemic has done to communities, and many communities in Chicago as well, is that people lack the ability to sort of raise their hand for help. The ability for someone that needs food assistance, housing assistance, it's not as easy for them to get in touch with a local community-based organization. And so we see this kind of, I think it was really the mayor's office that kind of saw that this newfound connectivity for these households really could change the way that services, both delivered by government here, by the city, or by other governmental entities, as well as community-based organizations, could actually reach out directly to folks in their home, as opposed to waiting for those folks to come to them. There's a real way to actually get them connected through this connection, to actually reach out to them and find out what they need, and then to be able to actually provide them with sort of a suite of services and support as well. And so what we discovered is that there's a pretty robust kind of adult learning digital literacy community here in Chicago. Some of those organizations were obviously struggling to transition from what would be sort of like a typical kind of like 20 folks in a classroom with a teacher up front. Actually, that sort of lesson planning to kind of shift dramatically to a virtual component. But we think it's absolutely critical, not only for parents to be able to help their students navigate the district's remote learning content, but also for parents to use the internet more effectively for themselves, again, to access telehealth resources, different jobs or sort of housing opportunities, workforce development, skills development. There's a lot of opportunities there as well. And so what we're doing is we're actually working with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, who've been a terrific partner and obviously been leading sort of community-led digital inclusion work for quite some time. We're working with them to develop a toolkit for all of our community-based organizations that will be publicly available to any municipality, school district, community organization around the country as well. But it's to sort of design, like, how do you do a digital literacy workshop in the context of coronavirus? So how can you, with kind of evolving public health guidelines about social distancing requirements, how can you actually build a program that can be nimble enough to be 100% virtual, to potentially offer maybe a hybrid option for sort of learning, or even to be able to hopefully at some point go fully in person. So they're kind of helping us create sort of a foundational toolkit for all of our community-based organizations to partner to be able to offer this type of digital literacy workshop programming. And then we have Chicago Public Libraries, who's going to be doing training on the Chicago Digital Learn platform, which is part of the broader Digital Learn, I think, kind of conglomerate, but where they're going to be training on specific modules that'll be, that then families, so it's kind of a train-the-trainer model where Chicago Public Libraries, the adult learning experts, will be training the community-based organizations who will then be conducting workshops with families. Chicago Public Library, they're also curating a list for us for sort of high-quality supplemental digital literacy resources as well. That'll sort of allow a family where, if it's just, if it's a grandparent that's responsible for 4 kids and they need to, create an email address for the first time so they can sign up for an educational software program so their students can learn, we'll be able to sort of help them through that. But then if it's someone who says, hey, I want to go get a certificate, a free certificate through, Coursera or something like that, that actually can help me get employed or potentially, take a job that might have been, in person that is now moving online, but they need that sort of coursework to help improve their skills to be able to maintain that position. We'll be able to offer something like that as well. And so, I think we would try to create a solution where, both organizations that have been doing this work for quite some time, how can we help them kind of transition to potentially delivering that content more virtually, but also for organizations that have never done this before, how can we kind of, get them up to speed and sort of help them stand up to some of this work, and then the ability to actually meet households and anyone in the household, be able to meet them where they are, not to sort of have like a canned sort of curriculum, but to have something where if you want to go through basic computing skills, there's a syllabus for that. If you want to do sort of this high-tech, higher level skills development, there's an opportunity for that as well.
Wow, really, really fantastic. Thank you so much, Hal. And I'm sure I already see that we've got a lot of good questions coming that we'll get to at the after we've done some of the perspective from the commentators. But I just want to make sure before we go on, can't remember if they had another slide or give us a sense of the last couple pieces here, and then we'll go on to our.
Sure. And I think, this is just an example of just like our partnership here in the city of Chicago, where, obviously with the local school district, with the city and the mayor's office, Kids First, this is kind of our roles and responsibilities for all the different partners that are serving on this. I'm excited to say, if I can, I'll probably do this during the next presentation, but we actually just had a case study produced by Education Superhighway that's coming out today about sort of the architecture behind Chicago Connected, as well as a toolkit that we've developed, about 40 slides, templates for parent communications, for all, sort of every aspect of the initiative, how to sort of set up your working committee, how to set up your smaller committees, all the kind of interrelated parts to this. Again, not sort of presupposing that folks want to sort of model themselves after this, but at least for school districts or municipalities that are considering comparable initiatives, at least they have somewhere to start. But this slide was just sort of meant to represent just the type of partnership that is necessary to launch an initiative of this scale, and to have all of our partners really kind of moving in the same direction throughout the planning process, and obviously now into the implementation phase as well. This is a little bit about, I know that you've got some other folks that want to comment, so I'll be brief, but this is just a little bit about some of our, out of our requirements that we have in terms of internet service providers. So I talked about a little bit about this, but not upselling folks, these kind of required speeds that we actually have indexed to the FCC's definition. So if the FCC does increase over any time the definition of broadband, that our families would automatically get those benefits as well. No restrictions in terms of existing debt with any of the internet service providers. That's a huge, barrier for folks to sign up, because they're worried about, debt collectors coming after them. And we say, nope, that debt won't be wiped away, but it doesn't preclude you from being part of the initiative at all. So
yes,
this is just a little bit about it. Yeah, you can feel free.
No, this is super helpful. And I was just going to actually interject that issue of having debt already has been an issue that OTI and other colleagues have raised for years, because there may be discount programs that internet service providers offer, but they require the family that's signing up to not have any outstanding bills, which especially now is almost impossible to be asking these families to pay all their extra the bills from like 2 years ago while they're struggling to find a job or to stay afloat for their rent payments. So really glad you raised that as well. Yeah, we'll move. This is fantastic, Hal. We'll have some questions for you coming. We'll shift now to hearing from both Matthew Henkes and Amina Fazullah to give us kind of a sense of how they're viewing this, and what thoughts are coming to them as they've heard these presentations, as well as any insights from their own experience. So Matthew, we'll start with you. Let us know what did you hear that might give you some hope, and how does it also connect with what you've learned in Council Bluffs, Iowa?
Sure, yeah, thank you. And I think the the conversation that Hal started is really interesting because there's a couple things I want to highlight that really was relevant in a totally different context, which is Council Bluffs, Iowa, where we're doing our work. And I'm going to do that by jumping forward real quick. So Sierra, if you're with me, if you can move forward about 2 slides and then one more. Okay, let me give you a little context about what I'm going to be, where we're coming from here. And I think it's helpful because I think the community solutions reflect a bit the community context. I work for the Iowa West Foundation. We're based in Pottawatomie County, Iowa, which is right on the border with Douglas County in Nebraska, which is the home of Omaha. And we are a private foundation that we say acts like a community foundation because we have a history of being deeply embedded in the community. And the program that we're looking at really is supporting a urban area that is part of the Omaha greater metropolitan area, but is also leads into a rural context. So it's kind of a peri-urban area. And it's a community of 62,000 people. And in the context of a metro area that is approaching 1 million, it's a small part, but we think an important part. And this is our primary area that we fund in. And so one of the things that I want to look at is really what Hal was indicating about partnerships. That's been one of the most critical pieces to the success of our program as well in Council Bluffs, as well as having a strong existing infrastructure to build off of from the actual hard infrastructure of the internet provision. And then the role that philanthropy played, I am part of that role in philanthropy, so of course I think that's a critical role. But Sierra, if you could back up a couple slides, please, to the first one with our vision. At the Iowa West Foundation, because we have such a broad vision, we really focus on a variety of areas, which includes economic development, education, community development, which we call placemaking, and healthy families, which focuses on human and social needs. And so you can see that something like the program that we're doing called Blink, which is free community-wide Wi-Fi, is really mixing through a lot of those different areas that we support. And if you move forward to the next slide, we have a process that we work through, which we do traditional grant making, but we also do initiatives. And initiatives are really driven by looking at systems change in our community. And this is a systems change process that was started by the City of Council Bluffs as well as the Council Bluffs Community School District. And they were the co-developers of this, much similar to how Hal had discussed the roles of the city and the school district there. And philanthropy played a similar role as well. If you would move forward, please, 2 slides. Part of what we set out to do was to provide access to high quality free public Wi-Fi wherever it was technically and financially feasible. And so what this will look like when it's fully completed is covering 20 square miles, which is half of the city. The other half of the city is actually in some hills and bluffs area where it's infeasible to actually technically provide the Wi-Fi. But also it will cover about 2/3 of the population. It's in the old urban core of Council Bluffs. And that's really where, from a demographic perspective, a lot of the poverty is focused. We have nearly 28% of our kids who are growing up in poverty in Council Bluffs. And we were really fortunate that Google came into town and provided free Chromebooks for the school system. And the kids each have, in a one-to-one way, a Chromebook for each of the students. But what we found is that a lot of them couldn't use them the way that they needed to because of a lack of access to internet. And so the idea was proposed that using the city's infrastructure and the internet access from the school district, was there a way to provide secure but filtered access for students while providing unsecure and unfiltered access for the general public to the internet. And we set out in 2015 to do that. And it's a partnership between, as I mentioned, the school district and the city, as well as Iowa West Foundation, the Charles E. Lakin Family Foundation, and Google has all been at the table. And in total, there were 7 phases. And I say 7 plus 1 because 7 phases within the city of Council Bluffs. And we added another city that's adjacent, Carter Lake, across the river. And that covers about 60% of their community when this will be complete. And it was targeted to be completed in 2022. Now, because of COVID, and similar to how Hal was talking about, COVID's had a major impact, obviously, on the provision of education. And so we've looked at accelerating this. And we're actually going to complete the free public Wi-Fi as it was envisioned by the start of the fall semester this year for our community school district. So what differs, though, is in our program, it's really about providing internet up to the home. It's possible to bring it in by buying a booster, but that's based on individual household decisions. And the way it was originally funded up until this year was that no tax dollars were involved in this program. CARES funding is actually going to be applied to accelerate the completion of the program. And then the other thing I think is obviously scope. We're in a smaller town. We're not talking about 100,000 students to the extent that Hal's program is, but we're looking at really, as I mentioned, 40,000 individuals being covered in one of the communities and a significant portion of the other city adjacent. So I think as I'm looking across these two things, the things that stand out to me, and I know we're going to have other commentators, so I won't go through everything, is just to focus on having the right partners at the table. Our school district said it just wouldn't have been possible to do this without all the partners that we have, and that's going to look different based on each community. And also finding the right solution that for our community, it wasn't providing internet in the home. We felt that for our community, a more sustainable option was to provide the community-wide broadband Wi-Fi, because that was something that we could build the cost into the public budgets for an ongoing support, and was really relying on philanthropy to build out the infrastructure for it. Those are a few of my thoughts on how we're similar and different.
Great.
I think some of the key things.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Matt. It's really, it is interesting to see that there are different ways to do this, or even in an ideal world, maybe we could talk about this later, it's both, right? If you can get a place where you've got that kind of public Wi-Fi, it's as robust as you're describing, plus at the home piece at the same time. But I'll just kind of plant that as a food for thought, and we'll go to Amina now to just get a sense from you, Amina, of what was going through your mind as you heard these presentations, and what you're seeing in terms of the need for advocacy pushes on this now, since I know that policy and advocacy is very much in your wheelhouse.
Absolutely. So let's start with the slides, because that gives us a sense of kind of what our starting point has been when we've been talking to policymakers. So the next slide, please. So we did a report just in the past month or so that focused on trying to scope out how big the distance learning digital divide actually is. And the reason we felt like there needed to be new numbers to understand this was because prior to this, we had always talked about the homework gap. And we even did a report in September 2019 on the homework gap. And that really gives you a very limited point of view on what you consider to be inadequate access. By coupling for a high quality device plus high quality connectivity to the home for students to be able to do this learning, we had a different understanding. So we felt like there needed to be a resizing of the digital divide. So what we found was about 15 to 16 million digitally divided students. K through 12
if I can interrupt, Amina. So that's super helpful, because the numbers that we had at New America, well, I know that Claire's numbers are updated in her report, but our earlier one where I said 12 million needs an update.
Yeah, I mean, that was the number I used right up until our report came out. So yeah, no, I mean, it's, we thought that was a pretty big number to begin with when we were talking about homework gap. Now that we're talking about distance learning and a digital divide, it's certainly bigger. So, I feel like there's a moment at some point, some good marketing brains will sit down and come up with a better name than homework gap at this point, but maybe it's the learning gap, I'm not quite sure. But it's certainly during social distancing, we've got to be able to sort of have a better perspective on what this looks like. Next slide. So what we're understanding is that, with schools closing, there's significant learning loss that has occurred and could occur this fall if we don't get the right tools in place for students to have access to distance learning, quality distance learning. And certainly being in school would be ideal and the best possible situation, but we also know that schools need to have as much flexibility, considering the current climate of the crisis, to be able to make the right decisions for their teachers and students and their families. So, we wanted to find exactly what we needed to be able to prepare students to do distance learning, and also prepare teachers to be able to do adequate, stand-up adequate distance learning as well. Next slide, please. So this slide just kind of talks through, the tech specs of what's required. And we actually pressure tested this with states, ed officials, with folks from the ed tech companies that are standing up these types of programs, with device manufacturers, with ISPs. We all sort of came to the same conclusion, which is you can't do distance learning on a cell phone. And this spring, our first foray into real distance learning ended up with many students using their cell phones. And that's not ideal. It's expensive, and it's just not a high quality device to work with. So certainly on the device side, we want students to have laptops or tablets, depending on their age. And then on the connectivity side, we want to ensure that everybody's got access to ideally fixed broadband or some kind of wireless broadband option like a hotspot, or a satellite broadband where those other options are just not feasible. Next slide. I think this is probably the most stark. There's nowhere in the country that is free from this distance learning digital divide. Even in the best states, 1 in 4 students don't have access to adequate internet connectivity or devices. And you know, that means that this certainly is something that I think everybody in philanthropy and at the local and state community levels are working hard to close. But this is definitely a moment that requires everybody to engage, and certainly the federal government. Next slide. And this is probably of no surprise that communities that are most impacted are communities of color. So Native American, Black, and Latinx students are much more severely impacted by the distance learning digital divide. And what we did note, which was also interesting, is that no community, urban, suburban, rural, is also safe from this distance learning digital divide. There are certainly higher numbers in rural areas, which we think is related to lack of infrastructure or lack of access to higher speed infrastructure. But certainly everywhere in the country geographically is also impacted. Next slide. And actually, if I could go back one slide, I did want to point out, if you look down at the bottom in this box, I wanted to note the Green Lining Institute's work, which highlighted that districts that were subject to financial redlining practices in the 1930s face a higher digital divide today. So certainly some of the inequities from our past are still impacting these communities today and have driven some of the disproportionate access that we see in both urban and rural communities. Next slide. And this is a little deeper into the tech specs. You know, what we found, again, after pressure testing this with all of the key stakeholders, was that robust distance learning requires robust access to technology. So ideally, if you're going to have multiple students in the household or multiple individuals in the household that are using technology at the same time, right? So if you're doing a Zoom conference call and got a student that's distance learning and maybe 2 students that are distance learning, which is not unheard of, then you're going to need at least 210. If we're talking about 25/3, that is certainly useful for baseline speeds, but it is definitely the minimum. And data caps and sort of other restrictions around connectivity will limit ultimately what kind of engagement students can experience. You know, one of the more heartbreaking stories we heard is that because some devices and connectivity were capped or limited through filtering, students weren't able to access their public libraries resources. They weren't able to apply for a digital public library card. These are the sort of you know, unintended consequences of restraining connectivity. Certainly you can lower the costs if you do that, but then you also have to deal with the fact that a student has a less robust experience. Next slide. And so we've priced out per our own numbers, so you know, that 16 million number, what it would cost in the first year to connect students. And we found that to be about 6 billion to 11 billion. That wide range exists because, you know, we're talking about refurbished devices if available, and trying to kind of find the lowest cost internet. So, you know, finding those baseline speeds around 25.3 or constraining connectivity through a capped or filtered service, then you'd probably come in at around 6 billion. But if we're talking about a more robust offering where you have more two-way video and synchronous interaction, able to provide wraparound supports from not just your teachers, but from counselors, we would be closer to the 11 billion number. Also, there is a supply chain constraint issue with respect to devices. And so it's very difficult for schools to be able to access low-cost laptops because there just aren't enough of those laptops built for this year. So it's forced schools to either purchase a higher end device or to reuse devices that are probably going to fail on them, or to use a device that really isn't adequate for their students, like a tablet for their older students. Next slide. And then I wanted to point out something that some of the speakers also mentioned, but it's worth noting again. Teachers also lack access. And when a teacher lacks access or lacks access to a device, they can't stand up adequate distance learning for, on average, another 30 students per class. And so we actually tried to get numbers on that as well. So on average, we've got about 400,000 K through 12 teachers lacking either access to a connection or to a device. And the cost to close that in the first year would be $1 billion. Next slide. So before we go on, I know it's time for questions and discussion. I just wanted to note one thing. I mean, it was really wonderful to hear about all the different partnership efforts. I think that's really critical. What we've been telling Congress is that certainly schools understand the importance of what they need to do, and they're pulling together assessments. They're reaching out to different partners. They're talking to ISPs and device manufacturers up and down the state. There's a lot of collaboration that's starting to occur. So really encouraging the federal government to provide funding so that states and the schools will be able to actually fill the programs that they're developing to be able to close this distance learning digital divide.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a really helpful additional context there. And we will go to Q&A. I know several of them have come up, but I actually, if I could, I'll take my moderator's prerogative for one moment, just kind of trying to stitch together across all 4 of these really compelling presentations, thinking about the state and federal role here. I have been wondering, I mean, what we're seeing, it sounds like, and so want any of you guys to jump in and kind of confirm or push back. What we're seeing is that the communities are, they recognize the issue, they're figuring out all the different partnerships that not every community, obviously, some of them may not have the bandwidth to do this in quite the same way, but certainly we're seeing Chicago or Council Bluffs or some of the places where Claire pointed out that things are working on the local level. It sounds like at the state level, there may be some barriers in terms of being able to like do a municipal based project. So we should maybe talk about that at some point in terms of whether there needs to be a push at the state. But more than anything, if I'm reading between the lines here, I'm hearing that kind of a lack of push from the federal level is allowing us to kind of not be our best selves, essentially. It's requiring communities to be kind of really stretching in lots of impressive directions, but really kind of stretching, and philanthropy's filling in, but how sustainable is it for philanthropy to always be filling in? So I just wanted to kind of lay that out and see if that is what you two are kind of hearing and reflecting on, and then so jump in with any comments to that, and then we'll get to the first question that's come in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start that. I've definitely found that states are doing incredible work. Schools are doing incredible work trying to get everybody connected, trying to get every student accounted for. But, you're asking them to basically, build the plane as they're flying it. It's absurd. It's incredible that teachers are coming up with a game plan if they get enough laptops, if they get enough connectivity. And then another teaching game plan if they need to do paper packets instead. If, they need to do something else. That's a lot of work that we're layering on top of our educational leaders. So certainly if there was leadership from the federal government to provide clarity that they were going to step in and provide this kind of funding support, that'd be really useful to be able to allow schools and states to plan, I think, a little bit more efficiently for what lies ahead in the next year of schooling.
This is Al. I definitely agree with about having some sense of for school districts to plan. I think we have a $50 million initiative here in Chicago. $5 million of that is actually CARES Act funding from the city, and so that's a kind of a one-time. We could spend that money by the end of this year, by the end of 2020 as well. I think longer term, I think this is one of those things where we kind of can't allow ourselves to go back to normal or back to the way things were before COVID, and so. I think part of that could include an expansion of the E-rate program, first and foremost, where we could just see new dollars coming in, and then flexibility for school districts and even local libraries as well to be able to use those funds for eligible families for at-home connections. And that could be hotspots, it could be Wi-Fi. I hesitate to just say, just put flexibility in there, because then you're going to be taking money away from school districts and libraries that rely on E-rate, both from sort of, ongoing operations, but also to help build some of the infrastructure, improvements that are necessary as well. But I think that kind of in tandem, a broadening of the E-rate pot plus flexibilities to allow for, to actually allow for connectivity to be paid for by those local institutions, those anchor institutions, would be tremendously helpful, I think, by the federal government.
Hi, I agree about the E-rate plan. I also think another important program to look at would be Lifeline. So Lifeline is one of the only federal program that subsidizes internet service. And so we definitely need to see more action from the Federal Communications Commission on that point, to make sure that people are getting signed up for Lifeline and getting access to these subsidies that will help them pay for their internet service.
Thank you all. We can keep going on that too, but let's see. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to let us know what a couple of the questions are that have come in, and how we can continue the discussion.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you, Lisa, for moderating the conversation up to this point, and to all of our panelists for sharing this really interesting and so incredibly timely and important information. A number of you have touched on rural areas and the digital divide and digital inequity. But Amy Bidden is asking if you know of any effective strategies for addressing internet access in rural communities. I think Amina and Claire in particular, you were talking a little bit about that in your presentations. Would you or others like to go into that a little bit more about strategies for addressing that gap?
Sure. In our report, we felt like it was important for us to cost out what it would take to cover every student that we identified. So certainly some of those students are in rural communities that don't have high quality internet access or don't have any access at all, that's in ground. And so, our pricing actually includes options that most people wouldn't put on the table, like satellite, just because its cost is really high to be able to even get up to that sort of 25.3 baseline speed. So we did add those costs into our assessment. So that gives you a sense of what those numbers would look like if you are incorporating something like satellite. But I'll say this, I think we've got a really interesting moment where suddenly every school is taking stock of the connectivity needs of their student. And for rural communities, that just doesn't just mean okay, which provider are we going to sign them up with, as you can do in Chicago or in LA. But I think it also can lead to, the state taking a critical eye at where they need to deploy infrastructure. And, if you can couple that with a change around community broadband and incentivizing community broadband projects, that could have huge benefits, because you'd suddenly have really great data on exactly what communities have access to, couple that, with in a moment where there's real initiative to get it done.
Yeah, I agree with Amina a lot. I think the data point is really important. We also just need better data on which rural areas don't have service. So right now the figures are often overstated because providers self-report whether they serve a certain area. And a lot of third-party studies have found that not all the areas that the FCC reports are being covered are covered. And that actually really matters a lot because there are funds available for rural areas to apply to get funds to build out more infrastructure, for providers to also apply for so that they can receive funds to build out infrastructure where needed. And yeah, again, I would say, I guess like an immediate solution might be if you do know of a rural electric cooperative or a telephone cooperative, working with the utility company cooperative in that way to make a network might be an interesting solution too.
Yeah, Claire, we've heard the exact same thing in some of the rural communities we're working with about how it's overstated what level of service people are getting, and that provides a barrier to getting the resources to build out that system further. I think the National Association of Counties had an app for a time, and I don't know how much it's still deployed, where if you were in rural communities, you could connect at any place at any point, and it started to give them information on building out a map of what the real true connection speeds are for a lot of those areas. And I don't know how far they've run down the field with that, but I know that for a time that was being promoted in our area as a way to start to address the question of what is the real level of access? Because without it, it's very hard to address it and get the resources you need.
Thank you for that. I'm assuming, Hal, that you might not have much to add on the issue of rural internet access. But we do have a number of questions, or unless you do.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, there's certainly some promising sort of sustainable solutions. I'm not sure how much they would essentially work for a rural community, but I know even, you know, we've been looking at like mesh networking here in Chicago potentially as an opportunity. You know, there's even some work being done with solar panels being sort of as a sort of like an energy source, and then having, you know, that being able to sort of tap into, you know, using that as a way to sort of help project some of the signal outwards. But I probably shouldn't speak to more given my urban background. I'll let the experts handle those questions.
Sounds good. I do have some questions for you there. There's a lot of interest in the Chicago Connected model that you were describing, a lot of interest in that. One person was asking about the funding behind it, and I think you touched on this a little bit in terms of the philanthropy organizations that provided that support. But how was the funding raised for Chicago Connected? What percentage of that is going to administrative costs? And also asking how is the actual service being delivered to families given the pandemic in terms of getting access to the devices while remaining socially distant? Sure.
So I'll do the funding first and then the devices second. So funding, you know, we did have a tremendous commitment by Ken Griffin, who's the CEO of Citadel here in Chicago. I know he and his staff you know, saw the report that we put out back in April and really kind of focused in on the fact that this is an achievable solution, right? I mean, the ability to pay for internet service for families that need it now to get their kids online to be able to engage in remote learning effectively. That was very personally compelling to him. I think his interest, as well as the Crown Family Philanthropies and a whole host of others, kind of created almost like a snowball, a very positive snowball effect where folks really wanted to get behind us. We had a $250,000 contribution, a personal contribution actually from President Barack Obama and Michelle Obama as well, who are obviously natives of Chicago, or at least Michelle Obama is a native of Chicago. And I think that there was a sort of a collective understanding that we have this opportunity where we knew, you know, even during last school year, we tried to get the initiative launched even last school year. We just took a little bit more time to operationalize rather than sort of announcing it and then trying to sort of rush our operationalize. We wanted to get it right for the implementation side. But people saw that, you know, for summer school for students that did not engage in remote learning, and obviously going into the fall, knowing that, you know, short of a vaccine that would be available to everybody, there was going to be some probably, you know, remote learning component for the 2020-2021 school year. So we were able to raise about $19 million in 6 weeks to have the philanthropic contributions for this. I will say that having the city putting in the $5 million in CARES Act funds also put some skin in the game for the city. And so that's essentially it's $14 million for the first year and then $10 million, I think roughly $11 million for year two. And so we've kind of broken out our philanthropic contributions kind of between year one and year two. And then it's roughly about $11 million a year operating expense that'll be borne by the Chicago Public Schools, the school district. And, $10 million at a time when, state funding for education feels at risk seems like a lot. But when you think about CPS has about a $6 billion operating budget, one day of instruction costs $10 million. And so to be able to have, reliable, high-speed in-home broadband or even hotspot broadband internet access for 100,000 students, almost a third of CPS's population for a year, it seems like a pretty nominal expense in the grand scheme of things. And so really, but I think it was important for the philanthropic community to see that the public sector was willing to put skin in the game, both now in terms of the CARES Act fundings, but also in the out years as well. And so I think, that's a tremendous partnership and sort of trust between the different entities, both with the city, CPS, and the philanthropic community as well. As it relates to the devices themselves, the routers themselves, touched on this a little bit, but essentially families, when they sign up, they have the option of either having a router shipped to them if they feel comfortable kind of going through the instructions to actually set that up in their house, or they have the ability to schedule a technician to come in, and both our internet service providers have a whole bunch of kind of protocols and safety related social distancing measures to make sure that while they can gain access to the house, there wouldn't be any concern about sort of proximity to folks. And so I would say that the shift, that the data I think thus far has been primarily suggesting that folks prefer the virtual option, the remote option, actually having the router actually shipped to them. And so we see that obviously, that's I think a benefit and a testament to even some of the customer service work that our internet service providers are doing to help explain to folks how to set these routers up in their houses. And our community partners will also be equipped with information about how to do this, so they can, if it's more of an easy troubleshooting solution, then our community partners might be able to at least point households to resources to help them get connected that way as well.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with you for a moment, but then I'd like to get other panelists' response to this question, or this kind of couple of questions. Yolanda Beckles is pointing out what we all know, that parent involvement and parent engagement in their children's learning is so critical. It's more critical now, especially that the learning is happening at home and parents are providing a lot of that support. So were devices provided in Chicago to parents to support them in that effort? And then on the flip side, we also know that a lot of educators don't have high quality, high speed internet in their homes. So, both sides of that teacher-parent support system for children's learning, how was that addressed in Chicago? And then I would love to hear the thoughts from the other panelists about kind of making sure that both parents and teachers, educators, have access to the internet and devices that they need to support remote learning.
Yeah, I think, so I think on the device side, and this is, it was not intentional, but somewhat, CPS has given about 128,000 devices thus far to households. And so, because they had a pretty robust strategy back in March, even and the district was actually getting there was a long-term capital plan of actually getting to a one-to-one for all students. And so they were well on their way to that. In some cases, it was getting devices out of the warehouse, getting them to schools more expeditiously, having different mechanisms through which that when people were picking up food, at different school sites, they could also pick up devices as well. And so we didn't focus as much on the device gap issue, although it's significant and very pronounced, because the school district was doing so much work to get those devices out, and is continuing to do work in preparation for going back to school this fall in that area. So we really kind of focus on the connectivity portion of it. I think as it relates to educators, I think that's a terrific point. We know that, and I don't want to probably say too much, but I know that the district did some polling both for families and also for teachers. It's teachers as well. And I think what teachers cited as the largest barrier for remote learning during the spring semester for students was a lack of student having internet connectivity. Whereas I think some of the teacher challenges with internet access was not. Often cited as sort of like one of their biggest barriers. I mean, there's a lot of other barriers that they had to remote learning, including having to sort of transition on a dime from going from in-person instruction to remote learning. But that was not cited. I would love to be able to say, I won't say it now, but that there would be the opportunity for Chicago Public School teachers to also be able to access this. And I think that's something that we could certainly look to expand in the near future as well.
I'll just, if I can jump in for a second, and I'll put this in the chat, there's a piece that we did on teacher access and trying to look at data across the country as to what we know about whether teachers have the access that they need, because that particular question has not really been asked quite that way. But one of the big challenges there is that in many, it differs state by state, district by district, but a lot of teachers are at almost like barely kind of poverty wages themselves, especially pre-K teachers and childcare teachers. And so given the audience for, you know, the grade level reading campaign and what we're thinking about when it comes to supporting families and making sure that those families have a preschool teacher, even kindergarten teachers certainly, but our preschool teachers and our childcare teachers are sometimes making poverty level wages. And so to be able to afford the internet access and the cost issues that Claire was, is a really big problem for them as well. And so we've even floated the idea of whether that should be something that they're given stipends for in this virtual learning world where they're having to figure out how to pay their rent and do all these other things. And should they also be having to pay their internet access to be teaching at the same time? Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. At Common Sense, we started our Connect All Students campaign by asking teachers and parents what they were experiencing with respect to connectivity and distance learning. And we had nearly 150 teachers respond with lengthy stories of their experiences. And a lot of them are focused on their kids or the students that they're working with. But we had a number of teachers tell us that, you know, they were uploading sensitive student files from the school parking lot because their internet connection was spotty and couldn't handle uploading secure files. You know, this is how teachers are doing their administrative work, by sitting in the front seat of their car. So, you know, we've suddenly entered into this period of time where the school infrastructure has been pushed out into the homes of the teachers. And it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to expect them to shoulder that on their own.
I know that our program was driven by devices first because of the one-to-one program that Google supported, but it didn't reach the parents, and I don't know that it reached the teachers either. And I think that part of the goal has been to provide a higher level of service to those students through the pipeline that's available through the school district because of the Chromebooks that the kids have access to. But the whole system's not built out to be able to provide streaming content to the general public. It's more meant for communications as well as for being able to access the internet, surf the internet, research things. So I think that still is something that's not captured by the way that we've approached it, but I think it was by design too, because with the amount of resources and costs associated with it, they really focused on trying to get the kids access. That was pre-COVID when this was designed. So now that the teachers' access is becoming much more of a critical issue in a remote learning environment, it is something that we may hear more about from the school district.
So we've had a couple of people asking about how to find out about something like this happening in their community, or Veronica Kapnick is asking, you know, recognizing that, well, it's hard to understand what's happening at the state level, and then also hard to figure out what a community-based organization can do to advance or promote action at the state level, but also to take on some of these efforts locally. You know, any advice for community-based initiatives that are wrestling with this challenge in this really tough moment? This is for any of you. Jump in.
I think in our case, and perhaps in the Chicago case as well, it was the school district and the city that were driving a lot of the early part of this. It sounds like Hal's organization was very involved from the beginning as well. But so I think to the extent that a lot of the grade level reading community members are engaged with the schools, it's really about forming the right partnerships and having the right people that, if it's not on the radar yet, getting that access. That's something that schools are actively grappling with. Our rural schools are grappling with that, and other school districts. I know in Omaha across the river, they've actually piggybacked on state contracts to try to provide internet directly into the kids' homes, but it's not a sustainable long-term solution. It's a short-term solution. So I think it's on people's minds, and now's the time to use the burning platform to try to get something to happen if it's not.
Yeah, I would just note that, you know, if your organization has a resource that you think would be useful for these students, you know, schools, like Matthew mentioned, are in the thick of it. They're looking for every possible resource to be able to provide to their students when they are distanced from them. So I would reach out there first. And then, you know, to the extent that we can think long-term, I'd say, you know, whatever we can do to create some real comprehensive assessments of what the need looks like and where we're lacking in resources, I think will be really welcome, because every policymaker wants to know what needs to be done. And that type of data will answer those questions.
Yeah, I put a link in to the chat, which is just more for the latter part, but about you know, a toolkit. I know the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has like a community-led digital inclusion startup manual. So that's, I think, a great kind of opening resource to find you know, low-cost internet packages. How do you actually do literacy training? All the kind of like, how do you set up a budget for these things? And so that's actually a document that we're working with NDIA on to kind of create for our CBO, our community-based organizations, to kind of put that in a little bit more of a, in sort of, you know, given the pandemic that we're in, like, how do you kind of convert that that work and how do you do that virtually, really? I think to the first point, just about how to sort of potentially replicate, I think, you know, having, you know, thinking about your engagement opportunities with public officials, right? So if there's city council meetings, if there's public school district, even virtual meetings, is potentially to have parents, you know, come to those meetings, families come to those meetings and sort of organize around the issue of you know, the lack of connectivity, or even the lack of devices, or just the homework gap, to talk from personal experiences. I think being able to marry that with data to kind of talk about how pronounced that is. And that's not necessarily that's going to work everywhere, but I think, you know, being able to hear from the folks that are most affected and then having concrete data that kind of gives a sense of how pervasive and how inequitable that divide is. If you marry those things together, and kind of just continue to you know, browbeat your public officials about those challenges, hopefully that will catalyze the type of you know, kind of response, particularly now when folks are really staring at schools opening very, very soon. I think it'll be hard to kind of launch a lot in the next couple of weeks, but at least you can get the work started and start the planning, operationalizing. And so students can have you know, hopefully an effective school year for 2020, 2021 as a result.
It's certainly possible to build a vision around it right now in light of the disaster, but I think there's an argument to be made around this and a vision to develop for a community even outside of COVID. It's a community economic development opportunity. It builds resiliency into the community. You know, if you're in a rural area, the opportunity to attract some of these younger professionals who are interested in different lifestyles than they might have grown up with, but need the internet access to be able to commute to work. There's a lot of opportunity there, but it requires the community coming together and leveraging the resources that are there.
Before we continue with questions, I just wanted to let everybody know that that poll that Sierra mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I've just launched it. Would really encourage you to take a couple of quick moments, share your thoughts and feedback with us through that. We'll leave it up until we close down this webinar at the end of our 90 minutes together, and we'll continue with the Q&A for right now. One question, somebody was asking about the Digital Reservations Act. Any thoughts on that? I don't know what it is, so I was hoping that you all did.
I haven't heard of that one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm not too familiar with it, but if this isn't in regards to like tribal broadband access, at least as far as OTI is concerned, I know that we are very much pro opening up spectrum, unused spectrum for communities to get connected. So just spectrum meaning like when we open up spectrum, we have more ability to have wireless networks. And for us, at least recently, what has happened is the window period in which tribes can apply for this unlicensed spectrum has been extended by 30 days, but that's not nearly enough time. There are like firsthand accounts of tribal members not even knowing how to go through the application process. And with the school year coming up, we definitely need to see more like that window expanded. But I'm not actually familiar with the specific act itself.
I think it's Senator Warren's bill. I mean, my understanding is it's similar to these issues around spectrum and tribal lands. So, you know, again, I think anything that is supportive of expanding infrastructure for tribal lands is going to be really important. And there's a whole host of different things that can support infrastructure build out, as well as just setting aside spectrum, but then also, you know, supporting them as they are looking to figure out permitting for projects, or certainly any kind of funding support is always going to be important as well.
So I realize we are coming to the end of our 90 minutes together, and I know we didn't get a chance to answer all of the questions. There were a couple of questions slash comments in the Q&A box about the potential for leveraging television broadcast as a way to address this, as sharing information and how-tos even about addressing the digital equity divide, as well as delivering content. We hosted a webinar in June, and we're planning a couple more webinars in partnership with PBS, maybe I believe in September. So I just wanted to let folks know to stay tuned for that, looking at how some of this educational content can be delivered via broadcast and public media to help while we are figuring out how to close this digital equity divide. Now we have finished up our 90 minutes together, but I don't want to close out without saying a huge thank you to our panelists today. Thank you so much, Lisa Guernsey, Claire Park, Amina Fazullah, Matthew Henkes, and Hal Woods for joining us at very short notice and sharing this great work that's underway across the country and in your communities to address this critical equity issue for children and students. I also wanted to thank everybody who's joined in with us for this conversation today. And I would encourage you, if we could bring the slides up really quickly, just remind you that we've got a couple more GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars planned for the coming weeks. One every Tuesday afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Hope you'll continue to join in for those and continue learning with us as we address the important work of birth through third grade language and literacy development. Thank you all. Thanks again to our panelists, and I look forward to seeing you at future GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.